Hey, welcome to Sound Faith, where the mission is to glorify God by building the fields of Christian philosophy, theology, and apologetics. I'm Tyson James, the president of Sound Faith Consulting, and I'm delighted to be joined today by two top tier philosopher theologians, Dr. Thomas J. Oord of Northwind Theological Seminary and Dr. Ryan Mullins of the University of Lucerne. Today, these two gentlemen will be discussing their views of God and creation. If you've followed our channel for any length of time, you know that we love to give away books. So today we're doing a giveaway on the live stream of copies of both of their books. We have Pluriform Love by Dr. Oord and Eternal in Love by Dr. Mullins. So the way you enter is just by submitting comments or questions in the chat or in the comments of this video. And okay, so let's go ahead and bring in our guests. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. All right, so before we begin, I'd love to get a little background from both of you. Dr. Oord, we'll go ahead and start with you. Let our viewers know a little bit about you, what you're working on these days, and where best they can find more about you.
All right, I'm coming to you from the state of Idaho in the U.S. I'm a theologian, philosopher, taught philosophy for quite a few years, but exclusively theology now. I currently work at Northwind Theological Seminary, but I also direct the Center for Open and Relational Theology. I come from an open and relational theological perspective, and that will come out in our discussion today, I'm sure. I've written a bunch of books, but the books that I've been working on mostly the last year is the first volume of a three-volume set on systematic theology. What I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've done a bunch of research on this. I think it's the first book ever written with the title A Systematic Theology of Love, which I think is intriguing that not only is love less often placed as the orienting concern of theology, but that there would be a systematic theology revolving around love, I think is pretty uncommon. But that's a little bit about me. Oh, I should say married, three kids, grandkids, living the grandpa life.
Great. Thanks for that, Dr. Oord. All right, Dr. Mullins, same for you. Let our viewers know a little bit about you, what you're working on, and where best they can find more info about you.
hmm So I am Ryan Mullins. I have a PhD in theology from the University of St. Andrews and a doctoral habilitation in dogmatics from the University of Helsinki. So I'm a docent of dogmatics in Helsinki and a lecturer in philosophy and theology at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. I coordinate a online master's program in philosophy, theology, and religions at Lucerne, where we look at all the Abrahamic faiths and some Aristotle and Plato and go through history and do a bunch of contemporary stuff. So, it's loads of fun. I've written quite a few books on philosophy of time and God's relationship to time. I've done some stuff on God and emotion. The big book I'm working on right now is looking at different models of God and trying to figure out how each model of God answers the question, why would God create anything at all? And then a whole bunch of weird problems that pop up along the way.
All right. Well, that's a little bit about our guests today. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're talking about the doctrine of creation, and while you both agree that God created the universe, you guys have very diverging views on what that looks like. So we're going to dive into that today. Let's begin by having each of you lay out your view and defining any terms that you think are important for the discussion, like good analytics are supposed to do. None of that dirty continental stuff. Dr. Oord, we'll begin with you. Go ahead.
Well, today I'm going to be proposing a new creation theory. I know that sounds ballsy to use the word new when it comes to creation, but although elements of my view have been found in other folks, I think as a whole, this will come across not only to listeners or viewers as new, but I think it is genuinely new when you take it from its overall perspective. The basic idea of this view is that rather than creating something out of nothing, God always creates. And so the shortest way to describe my view is to say God is the ever creator. The longer way to say it is that God has everlastingly been creating out of that which God previously creating in love, and this creating had no absolute beginning. So I'm rejecting creation out of nothing, but I'm also rejecting the idea that God first started creating sometime in the past. So this is the ever creator view. Now, there are a bunch of reasons why I'm rejecting creation out of nothing. I think those will emerge in our conversation today. But I want to say right up front that the case that I'm making is a cumulative case. I'm going to try to convince you, as the listeners and viewers, that taken as a whole, my theory is better than Ryan's. My theory is better than the classic view. I'm not going to say Ryan's an idiot. I'm not going to say creation out of nothing has no heft to it, um, that it's illogical or something like that. I'm not saying that. What I'm making the claim is that when we take all things into consideration, the scriptures, reason, experience, science, etc., ethics, I should throw that in there, that the case I'm going to make for my view that God is always creating everlastingly is much stronger than the case that God once existed alone, whether in Trinity or not, and then decided to create something out of nothing. Now, one way to get a sense of the kind of argument I'm making, because it's new, I'm sure it's going to come across as unusual, and there are going to be some quick assumptions people make because I've had conversations about this idea with lots of folks over the years. But instead of getting to try to squashing some of those assumptions, because they might emerge in my conversation with Ryan and in this, I guess it's a debate. I think I want to give you a sense of the overall claim by pointing to 6 words that I think help fill out the picture of the idea that God always creates out of creation in love. And those 6 words, conveniently, because I have a pastoral background, I preach from time to time. Those 6 words all begin with the letter M. So 6 M words to describe this ever creator's work. So the first M word is the motive. Um, One of the things that Ryan and I agree on is that trying to figure out the motive for God's creating is important. Um, you read some documents from the Christian tradition, let's say the Westminster Confession, you're going to get the impression that God's motive was glory. God either wanted glory or just at least thought that humans ought to be glorifying God. And so that was the reason God created. I think the reason God creates is God is motivated by love. And not just love for God's self, but love for others. So the fundamental reason God creates is that God is a God of love. God's nature is love. And love motivates, is the motive for God's creating. So that's the first M. The second M is the materials. I've already claimed that God everlastingly creates out of that which God previously created. And there was no beginning to this creating. So I'm not saying God stumbled upon some stuff and said, hey, I think I'm going to create a universe. I'm not saying that there's a reservoir of materiality somewhere that God never created, that God draws from when creating. I'm saying the materials that God creates moment by moment are the materials God created in previous moments, and this creating had no absolute beginning in a series, that the series is everlasting, we might say. So that's the second M. First one was motive, second, materials, third, the method. Because I think love motivates God's creating, and God's nature is love. I think God's method is going to be shaped by love. And this method, then, if love is truly relational, is going to be a relational method or collaborative, cooperative. So God never then creates unilaterally in the sense of God being a sufficient cause. Rather, this creating is always in conjunction with, alongside, out of, in cooperation, in collaboration with creaturely others. So the method, the third M, is a method of love, and it's collaborative or relational love. Third, or the fourth M, the modes of God creating. Here, I'm going to criticize, well, criticize probably too strong a word. I'll say it this way. I think my view has a great advantage over Ryan's and the traditional view in that I can say creating is an essential aspect of God's nature. Most theologians say God may or may not create. God could have remained all alone in Trinity or not in Trinity. We can debate Trinity stuff today if we want, but alone at least without creaturely others. And so they think that God's creating is contingent in the sense that God doesn't have to by nature create. I think God necessarily creates in one sense and contingently creates in another sense. So God has to create insofar as it's God's nature to create. So that mode is the mode of necessity. But how God creates is contingent based on what creatures contribute in the creative process. And I'm an open theist, so I think the future is open. God can't be sure exactly how creatures are going to respond today and in the future. So there's contingency built into this creative process. Not everything is that has to be because there's real creaturely agency, freedom, etc. So the mode is both necessary in one sense, in that it's God's nature to create, but contingent in the how and what God creates moment by moment. The fifth M, just to remind you, because I'm going to forget myself, the motive for God's creating is love. The materials is what God created previously. The method God's created is through collaborative relationality, so never all alone. Fourth is the modes, necessary in one sense, contingent in another. Fifth, using the word measure, because I need another M word, just to emphasize that God didn't decide to start creating. God's creating is everlasting. Um, I like to use the phrase repeated many, 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 many times in Scripture: the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. And so the measure of God's creating is not contingent to a particular time, or it didn't start at one time in history, or if you think time started, it didn't start when time started. This everlastingly creating is the measure of God's created in creating. One of the things, I can't help but insert something quick here, is when I talk about the measure of God's being creating being everlasting, a lot of folks will claim I'm arguing for an infinite regress, and I'm against that view, and that might come out in some of our conversations. And finally, the sixth M in my proposal is the meaning. I think God's motive of love and the collaboration that creatures have in the creative process means that we and life in general has ultimate meaning. That's the M word. God's creating provides meaning to us and reality. And this meaning isn't somehow unilaterally imposed because it requires this cooperative, collaborative, co creating work with creation. Our lives, moment by moment, have genuine, ultimate meaning. And not just our lives, but all creatures and all creation, because they're all co creators, have a kind of ultimate meaning that I think most theologies can't point to in the same way, at least. So I think I'm going to close here, even though I probably have more time than what I've taken. I want to close, given my audience, I want to close with some statements from Scripture. I think Ryan and I are both philosophically oriented, but we both care a lot about the Bible. And and because of that, I want to make some claims about my position vis-a-vis what I think Ryan's is going to be, even though I'm not exactly sure, but at least against creation out of nothing. The view that I'm proposing, that God always, everlastingly creates in relation to that which God previously created out of love, is far better supported by Scripture than the idea that God once existed all alone and created out of nothing. I'm not saying that my position is the only creation doctrine one could derive from the Bible. I don't think the Bible gives any support for creation out of nothing. but I think it gives lots of biblical passages and images and metaphors and analogies about God creating out of chaos, out of unseen things, out of possibilities, all kinds of chaos. There's all kinds of biblical passages that one could marshal to create a doctrine of creation, and it would be other or slightly different from mine. So I'm not saying mine is the only biblical supported creation view, but I am strongly saying the Bible in general supports my view better than creation out of nothing. Creation out of nothing is not anywhere in the biblical canon, not in Genesis, not in Second Maccabees, not in the New Testament. Although I admit that some Christians have read into scriptures and come to the Bible with creation out of nothing and then, I think, misinterpreted passages. But there's no explicit biblical support for creation out of nothing. There is lots of explicit biblical support for the idea that God creates in relation to other materials, creation, etc. And so, in that sense, my view has much stronger support. I don't know of any passage that says God has everlastingly been creating, so I'm not claiming that that is a direct, entailment of the scriptures. But the passage I mentioned earlier, that God, the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. That word usually translated steadfast love is hesed, and the word forever, olam. I think we make best sense of that by saying that God is always loving forever because there's forever other creatures for God to love. So that's not a direct support for my view, but I think it's an indirect support. And again, my view better emerges from Scripture than creation out of nothing. I think I'll stop there. And to stop, I think I'll just, in a sentence or two, quickly remind you what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that God, motivated by love, has everlastingly been creating, didn't start some time ago. And this love is a love that creates in relation to that which God previously created, never creating out of nothing. And therefore, we should rightly say, God is the ever creator.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dr. Oord. Before we get to Dr. Mullins, I just need to pull up this comment. Shane Montz, who, full disclosure, this is our graphic designer at Sound Faith. He says, what does this 14-year-old boy know about creation ex nihilo? I'm assuming that's talking about you, Ryan, and not Dr. Oord. Sorry, Dr. Oord, but yeah. So that was funny. I had to put that up there. He also says, love the work of these two great guys. Fantastic. That I'm gonna have to dock his pay for that. I think he's insulting our guest on the live stream. Come on, Shane. Come on. No, he's fantastic. All right, so fantastic. We've heard the opening of Dr. Oord. He's laid out his view and defined his terms. We'll turn it over to Ryan. Go right ahead, man.
Okay, so what I'm going to be doing today is defending the traditional doctrine of creation ex nihilo. I affirm a traditional doctrine of creation ex nihilo, but I have some non-traditional views on God. By non-traditional, I mean the traditions that are really old that you probably don't know. So there actually are in the tradition. But anyway, so here's the idea. So there was once a time when God was all alone. And so there's just God and nothing else. And then subsequently, God brought a universe into existence. So creation ex nihilo means that God created the universe out of absolutely nothing. There's no previous material, but it also means that the universe had an absolute beginning. And historically, in the East and the West, when you're looking at this idea of an absolute beginning, there's this question: what does it mean to begin to exist? And the answer historically has been something begins to exist when it is preceded by non-existence. You begin to exist in the sense of you weren't there and then now you are. There was nothing and then now there's something. You were not there and now you are. And so the same thing is the case about the universe. The universe wasn't there and then it came into existence. So when theologians were thinking about this idea of, the universe has an absolute beginning, and that means it wasn't always there. That means that just logically entails there's this state of affairs where God was all alone. Now, the historical doctrine of creation ex nihilo was often associated with a particular view of God's freedom. It's a view of freedom that's different from Tom's view. So in Tom's view, God is always creating and he has to create. He's got some sort of leeway, supposedly, on about like what exactly he brings about and how he brings it about. But creation ex nihilo is different. On this view, God is free to create or not create. God does not have to create anything at all. He could survey all the possible universes and go, nah, I don't feel like it, and just not create anything. So because of this, God is supposed to have a more robust kind of freedom. He's got this freedom to create or not create, and has a greater amount of discretion over what to create. And the discretion is supposed to be a larger amount of discretion than on Tom's view, which might create problems for my view. We'll see later when we're debating some of these things. Because the claim is that God could create from any wide range of universes that he wants, and God is going to unilaterally bring about the existence of that universe. How much unilateral work is going on there? It might just be like the initial stages of the universe. So maybe it's just God establishes like the Big Bang and sets the basic parameters for the universe, and after that he's kind of hands off. That's a view you could affirm. But that initial segment of the universe, God is doing all the work. Nobody else is around to do anything because they don't exist. So here's a question that pops up with this. What was God doing before he created the universe? Now, St. Augustine asked this question, and he says God was creating hell for people who ask these kinds of questions. And then Augustine goes, okay, that's a joke. That's a joke. I am not going to debase myself by telling such jokes. I'm a serious thinker, so I don't tell jokes like that, even though he just told the joke. And so he says, I don't really know the answer to these sort of things. He kind of moves on. He says there is no before creation, even though there is a before, because he thinks God is timeless. That's confusing. I don't like confusion in my theology, so I'm going to get rid of that confusing statement from Augustine. I'm going to say there is an actual, like, very literal before. Why? Because I think God is always temporal. I think divine temporality is an essential attribute of God. So instead of doing the joke answer that Augustine gives to this question, what was God doing before he created the universe? I'm going to give the answer that the Apostle Paul gives. So when you're looking at Ephesians 1, what you see there is that prior to creation, there is God plotting to take over the world. God is devising a plan for his creation. He's trying to figure out exactly how to bring about a particular goal. Because here's how I see it. God has a motive for creating the universe. And that motive is going to set the framework for all of God's subsequent actions. So I think that when you're looking through the New Testament, we can develop something that I call God's most central purpose. There are many purposes God has for creating a universe. But one of those most central purposes is to enter into friendship with humanity. And if that's one of God's most central purposes, then he needs to create a kind of universe where that's possible. And the sort of universe where that's possible is, I think, a universe where there needs to be law-like regularity that can establish a basis for creatures with a more robust kind of freedom to perform various actions, have opportunities to develop their character, and have opportunities to enter into friendship with God. So as I see it, you've got God prior to creation, all alone, surveying possible universes that he could create, seeing they all have different kinds of intrinsic values that he might want to bring about. And then one of the most central purposes is picking a universe where friendship with creatures is possible. Now, once God creates the universe out of nothing and establishes that, then God is constrained to bring about his goal for creation. So God cannot perform actions that go against that goal, because that would be irrational, because God always acts on the basis of objectively good reasons, because God is perfectly rational. So I do like Tom's view that God creates out of love, but I don't think that's the only motive here. I think there's an array of like reasons that God has at play. Love is one of them. Now I want to say something to support Tom before I close. When I'm looking through the history of Christian thought, it is really bizarre. You would expect divine love to play a much bigger role. And when I'm looking through all the different models of God throughout history, love doesn't often play a role at all. And in fact, a lot of times people will say love cannot play a role in God creating, because prior to creation, there's nothing there for God to love. And I'm just like, well, maybe don't have a silly definition of love. I don't, maybe that's your problem. Even open theists like William Hasker will say, yeah, love's not really the motive for God to create. I disagree. I think love is one of, not the only, but one of the motives for God to create. So Tom and I are going to agree that, yeah, God has a motive to create, and love is part of that story. Our disagreements are, I think the universe has an absolute beginning. I think God did unilaterally bring about the absolute beginning of the universe. And I think God's free to create or not create. And I think there is some biblical support for God existing without the universe. And Ephesians 1 is just one of them. So I'll end there, because then all sorts of stuff's going to come up throughout this debate.
All right, fantastic. Well, you guys have both laid out your views very well. And I'm excited to get into the meat of it now. Before we get into that, just a reminder, we're here with Dr. Thomas J. Oord and Dr. Ryan Mullins, who are discussing their differing views on God and creation. And as a reminder to all of you viewers, there is still time to get your comments and questions in for a chance to win a copy of each of their books. We will be selecting winners right before we end this stream, so go ahead and submit those very soon. So let's go ahead and get into the arguments for your views. And I know we went with Dr. Oord first. Ryan, are you okay with going first in this next segment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
Great.
There's two arguments. I guess I'll do one argument and give time for Tom to respond, and then do the second argument. Was that right? Okay. Okay. So the first argument I want to look at is this basic causal principle that causes are temporally prior to their effects. And so I take this to be a basic principle about causation. You see it affirmed by like Richard Swinburne and Graham Oppie. It's something that's widely discussed in philosophy of time. A very popular theory about the arrow of time, like why time has the direction it does, is that it's grounded in the direction of causation, because first is a cause and then is the effect. So here's why I think this is important for the present debate. So if God causes the universe to exist, then the cause must be before the effect. And that's precisely what I want to affirm in the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. There's this state of affairs where God was all alone, and then a subsequent state of affairs where God exists with a universe. So God is the cause, and so he must be before the existence of the universe. If God is the cause of the universe, then God must exist before the universe exists. So the very idea of God causing the universe to exist entails that the universe cannot possibly be co-eternal with God. So I'm trying to keep this quite short, but I want to discuss like a particular common objection to my view. So some philosophers, they affirm that there can be eternal causes with eternal effects. And so they'll say, well, God's an eternal cause with eternal effects, so my principle is false. And here's my question to anyone who wants to raise this objection. Can you offer a plausible example of an eternal cause with an eternal effect? And this thing is a very important question throughout history and today, because the claim that causes are prior to their effects, it's very plausible. It's something we regularly experience. It's widely affirmed in philosophy of time and within sane physics. But notice I said sane physics, not theoretical physics, that's like just kind of playing with numbers, because there's a lot of that going on. So Tim Maudlin, he's a philosopher of physics, and he says, like, if your theory cannot be physically realized, then you're just playing with numbers. You're doing math. You're not doing physics. And I think that's just a really good way to live by. You should get that like cross stitched and put it in your kitchen. So here's the claim I want to make. If you reject my causal principle, you need to offer a plausible counterexample. And all of the plausible counterexamples I'm aware of bring up like all sorts of really serious problems. So historically, here's one, and I'll just end on this. So there's a bunch of Platonists who were like, well, there was this, imagine there was an eternal foot resting in an eternal bit of sand, and it's eternally causing this eternal footprint. And I'm like, this is a really bizarre thought experiment. There's this like detached foot just kind of hanging about from all eternity. How did it get there? And why is it in that one spot on the sand and not another spot? This just doesn't satisfy any basic principle of sufficient reason. So I don't find it to be a plausible counterexample. And so this is what I'm pushing right now is a very old argument within Christian thought. It actually predates John Philoponus in the 500s. who was one, like the earliest proponent of like the Kalam cosmological argument. So so there's a long history of people going, what are you talking about? So if you want to push forward a plausible counterexample, give me something where the answer isn't just like, what are you doing? Yeah.
All right. Before we go into your arguments, Dr. Oord, do you have any pushback to give on Dr. Mullins' arguments?
I do. Yeah, for this one, isn't he going to do 2 and then I'm going to come back? Is that what we decided, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm on board with Ryan's claim that causes are temporally prior to effects. Yep, I think he's right about that. When he says that eternal causes can't have eternal effects, if I'm understanding him right, that word eternal is functioning, I think, in a timeless way. So a timeless cause can't have a timeless effect. And since he and I are both, divine temporalists, we're both going to reject that. I think, though, I could have 2 responses to Ryan, what I think is the heart of Ryan's objection, even if I'm wrong about this eternal thing being timeless. But I can have 2 ways to account for this. One is to say God is never the cause in my proposal, because God is always a necessary cause alongside other causes for any particular moment. So I could say, prior to the start of this universe, before the foundation of the world, to use the Ephesians passage, God was a necessary cause, but not a sufficient, not the only cause in bringing about our universe. And so that would be a way to say, yep, God was temporarily prior to the first moment of the Big Bang, we might say. So that's one possibility. The other one, and maybe this one's even clearer, is to say, Ryan might agree with me on this. We'll find out, I guess. I think as a temporalist, my person who thinks that time moves moment by moment, a presentist, I think that every single moment of my life was preceded by something else, and God was one of those. But I could say that creaturely moments are always temporarily preceded by God's acting. You might say is sort of the between moments. My moment and then this previous moment. In between each of those, God also acts. So God's temporally prior to this particular moment and temporally prior to the first moment of our universe. And so in that sense, God is always the prior cause to any cause. So I think in general, I'm on board with Ryan's major claim that causes always are temporarily prior to effects.
Okay. So sorry about that, Ryan. So that was your first argument, and then you have a second. So we'll go ahead and with the second argument then.
Let me respond briefly to this, and then because it builds into the second argument.
Okay.
I don't know what a between the moments is. I don't know what that means. I do like presentism, you know that. I love that. So I think only the present moment of time exists. But I just don't know what between moments is. Can you explain that? Like, I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Yeah. It wouldn't be like an extra time dimension in life. It would be, let's say Tom has got a series of moments, 1 through 10. And we're looking at moment 4. The previous moment, moment 3, God would be acting.
Mm-hmm.
And there would be other, actors alongside God. So maybe that between would be not between 3 and 4, but between 2 and 4. So it would still be a series of moments there.
Okay. So basically, you're just affirming this causal principle is the big. Yeah. Okay. I like that. That's fine. This is good. It might not be good for you in a moment if you don't like the next argument. But we're getting there. I do want to clarify something you did say, because you were like, am I taking this eternal cause and eternal effects kind of thing? Am I taking that to be timeless? So this is a problem when you're looking at the history of these debates between eternal creation and creation ex nihilo, is people keep throwing out eternal causes have eternal effects. And every case I'm aware of equivocates on the word eternal there. So Proclus is an example of someone who wanted to affirm an eternal universe, and John Philoponus was like, "No, creation ex nihilo, come on." And Proclus was like, "Eternal causes bring about eternal effects," and Proclus is like, God's timeless, so it's a timeless cause, but it's bringing about a temporal universe, and you're like, well, that's not. You're changing up the word eternal meaning,
Right,
what it means
right.
here. And so I've in the book I'm working on, I'm trying to figure out a way to develop the argument where you could say like God's temporal, and so you take eternity to be temporal in both cases, but you're gonna that my causal principle will just come back into play. So it doesn't like the argument doesn't make any sense. Like temporal causes have temporal effects, and you're like, well, duh, but like, is the universe like without beginning? Like, so it doesn't get anywhere. So yeah, so I think you're right to point out like those arguments typically are based on timelessness, but I want to go further and go, those arguments are actually typically based on equivocation. So it's bad.
Mm.
Okay, so let's get into the next argument then. So we agree that causes are temporally prior to their effects. So there's this other really popular argument throughout history about that's related to like the Kalam cosmological argument. I'm going to make it simpler than this. So here's an argument you see from like John Philoponus, who I already mentioned, Al-Ghazali, Bonaventure, and William Lane Craig. Um, these philosophers, they get obsessed with these unnecessarily complicated thought experiments to try to demonstrate the impossibility of reaching an actual infinity through successive addition.
Mm.
So like Ghazali's got this really complicated thing about imagine there's reincarnation and these souls are constantly reincarnated and these universes rotating and you're just like, you just get lost. It's like a really complex like math problem in high school. And you get like, all this trauma from like being bad at math class in high school, or at least that was just me.
Mm.
You don't need any of this to get this really basic point that it is impossible to reach an actual infinity through successive addition. So here's the claim. If you start counting now, will you be able to reach infinity? And the answer is no, you will never be able to count up to an actual infinity. It's not a matter of like, do you have enough time or something? It's just you cannot reach an actual infinite through successive addition. If I ask you to start counting down from now to discern how many previous moments have passed, you will never reach an actual infinity because you cannot reach an actual infinite through successive addition. So here's the big idea. If anything is obvious about our world, it is the fact that our world undergoes a constant successive addition of moments. So it doesn't matter what ontology of time you affirm. You could be a presentist like Tom and I. You could be an eternalist for some reason, because like maybe you like outdated physics from 100 years ago. All of the major ontologies of time affirm real succession in the world. And so that's going to contradict the idea that our world could have an actually infinite past, since it is impossible to reach an actual infinite through successive addition. So a lot of these different eternal creation views, these everlasting creation views, they're typically understood as affirming an actual infinite past to the world. Now, if people were paying attention, Tom earlier said he wants to reject an infinite regress. So I'm curious to see what Tom has to say about this. But the main claim I'm making is it's impossible for the world to have an infinite past because you cannot reach an infinite through successive addition, and our world quite clearly and obviously has a constant successive addition of moments.
Love it. Shall I respond,
Oh,
Tyson?
yeah, feel free.
Yeah. I think this is one of the stronger, well, stronger is not the right word. This is one of the arguments that is the most vexing in this whole discussion, and Ryan's put his finger right on it. And I think it's most vexing because there are some metaphysical um, moves that go on that make it difficult for anybody, the most, the scholars and the laity, to try to make sense of things. First problem here is the ambiguity of the word infinite. What the heck does that mean? Um, at its core, it's just a denial of the finite, not finite. So it's a negative theology move. But I think most people want to say more than it's just not finite. And but it's very difficult exactly what's involved there. And you've read the literature, Ryan. You know that the word infinite is used in so many different ways. But I think there's another move here, and maybe you've come across this in literature too, but I haven't seen it, so I'm going to say I'm going to peg it, shoulder the responsibility for this move.
Mhm.
I think there's a confusion of metaphysical categories. In metaphysics, we sometimes distinguish between that which has an ontology and that which is real without an ontology. So abstractions like numbers and those things can be real, but they don't actually exist in the world, at least on some metaphysical views. Whereas a marble actually exists. My life, my personhood, my being exists. I'm more than an abstraction. So when this word infinite is used to talk about an infinite set of actualities or infinite set of moments, of succession of moments, I think they're imposing an abstraction upon actual states of affairs. And it may make a lot of sense to use infinite sets in mathematics because those are abstractions. But when it comes to actualities, and if you're like Ryan and me and you're a presentist, you don't think the past actually exists, it's not actually there, it's the present that actually exists. That word infinite then confuses the conversation because it's applying an abstract concept to that which is actual. To put it in a really blunt way, um, 10 unicorns and 10 mermaids don't mean there's 20 actual beings in the world if there's no such things as unicorns and and mermaids. So those abstract ideas don't putting them together doesn't mean there's actual things in the world called those. And I think that's at heart here with this worry about an infinite set or an infinite succession or adding to an infinite and all that sort of thing. It's imposing an abstract notion that can't be accounted for by actual entities. I'm getting super nerdy here. Sorry, Tyson. What do you think, Ryan? Have you seen that in the literature, or am I the weird duck that bring that up?
No, there's this medieval Jewish debate over this. I can't remember the names of the people involved, but if you read Sam Liebman's The Principles of Judaism,
Yeah.
when his chapter on creation, he's looking at the history of some of these debates, and he's got a section that runs the exact same kind of argument that you're talking about.
Mm.
So the move was to say, well, yeah, presentism is true. So there's no infinite collection of moments that's actually existing right now.
Right.
And the response was, there's a couple different infinity arguments we're looking at. You're missing, you're attacking one and not the other. And so I want to make the same kind of response right now. So William Lane Craig, when he's defending, his like cosmological argument, one of the arguments he runs is it's impossible to like reify an actual infinite to make it concrete.
Mm.
And so like does all this Hilbert's Hotel kind of crazy stuff. So again, those are like what's one of the many ridiculous counter or examples of like this infinity stuff. And I'm like, you could just make a really basic point without all these crazy thought experiments.
Yeah.
But what that thought experiment's trying to do is say, well, this is just impossible to have an actual infinite be like concrete and realized. And you're wanting to say, right, yeah, I agree, because the present's the only moment that exists. So these other past moments, they're no longer there. That's not the same argument that this particular infinity argument's trying to do. So the infinity argument's saying you can't reach an actual infinite through successive addition. So the number of past moments, there is an actual fact about that. And that fact exists right now. So if we were to like be like, God, what were you doing the moment before this? He'd be like, well, I was doing this. What were you doing the moment before that? He'd be like, well, I was doing that. And then be like, how many moments have you been doing stuff? Like that's like a meaningful question you could ask God, and there would be an answer to that question. And the answer cannot be infinite, like an actual infinity. So maybe that's a better way to think about this. So let me rephrase the question now. If we ask God right now, how many moments have you been creating? Would the number be a finite number or an infinite number? If it's an infinite number, I want to say that's impossible because you cannot reach an infinite through successive addition. And you and I both agree there's been a successive addition of moments prior to this one. So maybe think of it this way: like if we ask God how many moments has He been creating, what would the answer be?
Yeah. I think God would say neither finite or infinite can capture what's actually been the case. So
Okay,
I think God would dodge.
you just dodged the question. Okay, I guess
Because
on
even in
yeah, go
your
ahead.
because even in your response, you went back to the language of actual infinite, and I was
Mhm.
denying that that was a category that made any sense. So,
Right. Well, but
um,
you understand the idea of like the
yes,
difference
yeah,
between like a potential and actual infinite.
I do. I get it. I get what's trying to go on. I just think the
Yeah.
categories are mistaken. Um,
hmm I
so,
mean, I can agree with you that when mathematicians are talking about infinity, the amount of ambiguity and equivocation that's going on is just insane. I think it's just irrational. Um, eh, but since you and I are trying to not be insane and irrational, let's go be like, okay, I know what you mean when you say potential infinite. I know what you mean when you say actual infinite. And I'm going to ignore the rest of your inabilities to articulate things clearly. Which one are we going with? If you want to be like an Aristotelian like me, you want to go, there's just potential infinite. Like, get rid of this actual infinity nonsense.
yeah, yeah.
Is that kind of the move you're wanting to make?
I think that's closer to what I'm saying for because I don't want an actual infinite. I think there's also a problem. We can criticize the mathematicians, but I think we can also criticize the theologians.
Oh,
You
easily.
know,
Yeah, all day long.
I mean, you take an open theist like me. Well, actually, let's not use me since I don't like the word infinite. Let's say Bill Hasker. I haven't talked to him
hmm
about this, but I'll bet Bill uses the word infinite to talk about his view in God's and time. But
He
so does
does.
someone who's not let's say a Paul Helm or somebody like
hmm
that who's not an open theist. And then you got Bill Craig, who's got a God who's timeless prior to creation and then timeful with creation, and he's going to use that word infinite. So like
hmm
the word just seems to have no real status in my way of thinking when it comes to these debates. And so to
Right.
criticize someone because their God isn't infinite or has an infinite regress or an infinite set. It's just like, we don't really even have a good consensus on what we mean by that word infinite.
Right. So I agree because I tend to be of the opinion we should just remove infinity from theology as much as possible because
Preach it, brother. Preach it. Yeah.
it's usually just a way for me to just say like my God's infinite, yours not, so therefore
Yeah.
I'm better. And what
Yeah.
does infinite mean? My view. That's obvious, you know. So like so I think this is right. But
Uh,
we can get clear on something though, which is about is there an absolute beginning to the created order?
right.
And so if we ask that question, how many moments has God been creating? If he can somehow give a finite answer, like if he's like, well, it's 1 trillion something or other, and I'm like, okay, that means there would be an absolute beginning to the universe, which fits with my view, but it doesn't fit with yours.
Yeah.
So that's why I
You
think it
know,
matters, like if God's going to dodge the question or not.
here's the way I think God can dodge the question that might seem more plausible to you. What if we changed it just slightly and said, God, how many moments have you been existing?
Mhm.
Now, would you say a finite number or an infinite? I think you'd have the same problem
Oh, I
there.
say finite. Yeah.
Oh,
So yes, I didn't articulate this in my opening statement. I should have. So when you look, so on my view, this is similar to this guy named Al Baghdadi in the Middle Ages, and similar to Richard Swinburne in his later work. So here's the claim: prior to the existence of the universe, there's just God all alone, and that's a
yeah.
single moment because a moment is the way things
Oh,
are, but could be subsequently otherwise.
gotcha.
And that moment did not begin to exist because what it means to begin to exist is to be preceded by non existence. Well, that moment, it never began to exist because it's just God hanging out. It's not like there was nothing and then there was God. It's just God.
Yeah.
What brings about the next moment is God doing something because a moment is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. When things are subsequently otherwise, that's the next moment. So I'm happy to say it's finite. There's just like one moment, and then there's another one when God's like, here's me and a bunch of stuff, cosmic stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm obviously against that position
Mhm.
for a number of reasons, but I didn't think about that as I don't think that's the right way to think, so didn't even
Sure.
enter my mind that you would
Yeah,
go
yeah.
there. But yeah, I can see you can make that argument. Yeah.
All right, fair enough. So I think we should get into the next Tom's
Oh
arguments.
yeah.
Yeah, just a real quick clarifying question
Mhm.
there for Ryan. So God is in this initial moment without anything else. Does this moment have duration, or is it just there's usually a distinction between an instant and a moment. So how do you cash that out?
I don't know what the difference is between an instant and a moment. I take duration to be a property of a timeline when you're talking about a series of moments. So if like God pressed pause on the universe, well, that's a moment where everything's paused. How long does that pause last? I don't take that to be a meaningful question. I think things when you're trying to establish what are called temporal distance relationships, you need to have a series of moments where you can plot, where you can go, okay, start the clock there, and then it goes till there. Then we can meaningfully talk about duration. So I don't think duration is a category that applies to single moments. I think it applies to a timeline of a series of moments.
Okay, so then do you run into any sort of Zeno's paradox, like with an infinite number of moments between any two finite points
You
on the
could,
timeline?
if you, okay, so there's another debate. This is, I don't know how nerdy you want me to go with this. So
I
there's a,
already introduced the nerdiness, so
you
go
did, yeah.
ahead. Yeah.
So there's a debate between what's called the discrete time and dense time. Time is dense if and only if between any two moments there's another moment, and you're like, okay. Whereas time is discrete if there's like, well, there's just a moment and then another moment and another moment, and that's it. Like there's not between every moment there's another moment. Why I don't know why I should think this. Um, but if it's dense, then between any two moments, there's another moment. And then you get all the Zeno's paradoxes. You get these weird infinity, like nonsense kind of stuff. And I'm like, why would I do that? One motive for doing that is when you're, as a mathematician and as a physicist, when you introduce infinities, it makes your equations easier and simpler. And so I'm like, okay, my friends like that were doing their PhDs in physics, like they were really stressed out. They look like they're really losing their minds. And so I'm like, if that makes your life easier, fine, throw an infinity in there. And they're like, yeah, because if I have to like go with discrete time, I have to like find all the times and plot it out. And I'm like, well, okay, well, fine. Make your life easier. Just get the PhD done, move on. But at some point, I want to go. Do we want to base our metaphysics off of that? Um, I don't think so. Making people's lives easier should not be like a basis for metaphysics. Here's one final argument against my view, though. Craig has this argument. I never understood it. If time is discrete, he's like, well, reality would like be really jumpy. Like it'd start and stop because you'd be like one moment, you just jump to the next one and jump to the next one. I'm like, what does that possibly mean? Like the moment is just one and then the next and then the next. Like I would have that even if between any moment there was another. I just don't understand this jumpiness like claim. Like I find that really bizarre. So yeah, so my view, it makes the lives of mathematicians more difficult, but I don't care. I make everybody's lives more difficult, so it's fine.
All right, so difficult theologian Ryan Mullins, he has given his arguments for his view. All right, Dr. Oord, we're going to turn it over to you. Dr. Oord has like 400 different arguments for his view, so he's going to give all of those. We're going to be here for the next 12 to 14 days, and then Ryan's going to respond to those. So, Dr. Oord, take it away.
Well, I think before I jump into those, I want to note here, since Ryan has brought this kind of in a psychological direction, um, that there are psychological dimensions to this whole discussion in the form of what we're comfortable with affirming that seems unusual, at least. So, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that something can come from absolute nothingness. That just seems so unsettling. And I'll make arguments from science and my experience to, whatever. But I admit that my view that God everlastingly has been creating out of that which God previously created. This notion of an everlasting creating process, that feels uncomfortable to some people too. It feels weird, unusual. Like they're like, boy, I got to swallow that metaphysical pill. But Ryan's got something too that makes me uncomfortable, and that is that God can have one moment that is prior, God is all alone in one moment prior to somehow having a temporal series. That's a uncomfortable thing for me to swallow, but he's probably a little more comfortable with that than my option or maybe some of the others. So anyway, just thought I would mention that to get going.
Mhm.
You want to
Before we
respond? You
move
want
on,
to?
Dr. Ord, real quick. So
Yeah.
we've got some comments saying that your audio is a little low. I don't know if you could just real quickly maybe
Does that
somehow
help
adjust your
any?
mic or turn. I'm not sure,
Can
but
you hear any difference between that and that?
yeah, it's a little bit louder when you have it
When I have
pulled
it up.
up. So
Okay.
perfect. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Alrighty. Sometimes when it's up, you can hear me breathing through my nose, so I'd keep it down. So I guess that's not a problem this time. All right. So I think we're going to then transition. I've just completed the first volume of a 3-volume systematic theology. And a couple of the chapters, there's one whole chapter on creation theories where I give a bunch of arguments against creation out of nothing, look at some science, and even bring up Bill Craig, since Tyson, you're a fan of his, and criticize his views on things. But in the chapter in which I'm proposing my own positive replacement, I give, or oh, no, we are going, never mind. I set that up wrong. We're sticking with my arguments against creation out of nothing. Isn't that right, Ryan? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So, in the one chapter where I'm arguing against creation out of nothing, I bring out 11 uh, arguments against it. And am I right, Tyson? We're going to kind of go through these one by one, or should I read all 11, or what do you think is best?
Yeah, I think we said. Let me take a look here. That we were going to go through 1 through 5,
Hmm.
and then maybe 7, 8, and 10. And Ryan said he preferred to skip 9 and 11 since they seem like examples of evil. So maybe
All right.
just
I
yeah.
want to suggest that we include 11 for a reason that probably is not obvious to Ryan, because I saw
Okay.
his worry about that it might be repetitive of one of the other ones. So anyway,
Okay.
Yeah,
so
sounds good with me. Yep, go
since
ahead.
there's so many, I'll try to make it quick. So the first one, Ryan, what do you think of this? The what I call the theoretical problem, and that's that absolute nothingness can't. Oh, actually, let me preface this by reminding my viewers that I don't think any 11 of these are like logical deductions of some sort. I think I'm making a cumulative case. So that's why I've got all of these things here. And I think taken together, that they make a stronger case for my view and against creation out of nothing. So, one of the problems with creation out of nothing is that what I call the theoretical problem, that absolute nothingness just can't be conceived. It's intellectually impossible to imagine nothingness. What do you think of that, Ryan?
I hear this like often, but philosophers are like, yeah, there's this concept of universal negation, uh, and so we've got the concept, and we know how to even come up with a symbol for it in logic, if that matters to you. Because sometimes when people come up with logical semantics, I'm like, thank you, but this one I do feel is like quite straightforward. It's just like, yeah, universal negation, nothing, boom. But when we're talking about creation out of nothing, it's not universal negation. It's just God, and that's it. And I find that pretty easy to conceive of. And in fact, I don't know how to write a systematic theology without just kind of just doing that, because I'm sure when you were writing the systematic theology, like the doctrine of God portion, there were a bunch of times where you're sitting there not thinking about anything else other than just kind of contemplating God. Um, and of course, like other stuff pops up of like, well, God loves me, so there we go. But like when you're thinking about some other divine attributes, you probably had a moment where you're going, God, and you weren't thinking about anything else.
Yeah,
So I'm
so you're
thinking like phenomenologically, you may have had a moment where you did think about just God and nothing else.
Yeah, that's a little bit different what I'm saying. You're
Mhm.
saying that as a person who advocates creation out of nothing, you're not really uh, because God exists. It's not absolute nothingness. Uh,
Correct.
gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe if I tweaked it and said absolute nothingness, absolute creative nothingness can't be conceived. Would that
Mhm.
make any difference to you?
It might, but I was thinking about this earlier, and I'm like, I wrote a book Now the physical like manifestation of the book, like that came from some previous stuff, but like
Yeah.
the ideas, I don't know. Maybe I produced them from nothing. I don't have any kids, but like, that consciousness, that wasn't there, and then it was there. And I don't think consciousness is material stuff, because I'm a dualist. I think this might be a point of disagreement for us, but
Yeah.
consciousness did you make like some consciousness out of nothing? I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, since we have 11, I'm not going to
Mhm.
belabor each of these.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Two, historical problem. One of the things you've probably seen me write about, and others as well, is, and maybe this one doesn't matter to you much, but that the idea of creation out of nothing was first proposed as a Gnostic way to say, look, we don't want God messing around with an inherently evil world. So this is kind of a genetic argument that the origin story is unsavory. What do you think of this one?
So when I was digging into this, so I went back to like Marcus Bachmuel's work, and I thought I remembered you citing him, but then I was also looking at, you didn't look at, okay, so Bachmuel, his work on creation ex nihilo, he traces the history to Second Temple Judaism, so that obviously predates the Gnostics, and Paul Blowers and Richard Norris, the same thing. They'll trace it to like kind of this sort of time period. But one of the things Bachmuel points out, though, is creation ex nihilo was developed as a reaction to the Gnostics. It wasn't from the Gnostics. So
That's very
that's
different from what Gerhard May says in his work.
exactly, and so he's responding to May, and so that's what I was kind of going, hang on, I think there's some debate here about like the actual origins. But David Cheatham in his recent book too, this just came out like a couple months ago. He's got a Cambridge element on creation. He says the same thing. Like if you could trace the history back to Jewish sources, and you see some of the reception history of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the early rabbinic literature, you can trace it back to, so it would predate like Gnosticism. So I guess the claim would be you just got the history wrong. But say you didn't get the history wrong, I would still go, who cares? So like I can't, like, because everybody who's defending creation ex nihilo throughout history, like they're after the Gnostics, they're just like, a good God created a good universe out of nothing,
Yeah.
and so they would just kind of shrug their shoulders and be like, meh.
Yeah, I think this one gives you a taste of what matters to you and me, probably compared to other people. I'm with you. I think this is one of my weakest of the 11, but I definitely have friends for whom historical precedent really makes a big difference. In fact,
Yes.
that's one of the reasons they accept creation out of nothing. Maybe even the only reason in some cases is that the church has always said this to be the case, and therefore it's got a good origin. We have to accept the origin. And so when Gerhard May comes out with his book, decade or two ago, and
Right.
says no, it's got a Gnostic origin, to some of my friends, that's very upsetting. Now, even if I sort of account for that and say, look, that doesn't matter to me nearly as much, I have to admit that how do I say this? Because of my particular view of the intrinsic value of the created world, I am a little suspicious of Gnostic tinged theologies, and so this one still has some measure of power, even though it's not. I think it's one of my weaker ones.
Yeah, so I get because the historical point is, you're right, because one of the reasons I do a lot of historical work is because people won't listen to the arguments until I say, look, I did my holy homework, like I've read all the history stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Like if a view did have like, it's kind of wrapped up in this bizarre sort of like the world's intrinsically evil, that would definitely make me uncomfortable and go, okay, let's think about this for a hot second. But yeah, if Marcus Blockmule and the more recent scholarship is right, then it would just be like it predated it, and when it really became a hot thing in Christianity, it was in reaction to Gnosticism, not from the Gnostics. But I can't remember what May said because I haven't read May in like 20 years. So,
Yeah.
but I remember seeing you cite May, and I was like, I want to read something else. I don't like rereading things again. So I
Yeah.
can't remember what May says.
All right. I'll look for your
Mhm.
source on that one too.
I'll
Although
send you that stuff later.
yeah. All right. Third one. This one has a long history of folks foisting this one up. What I call the empirical problem. We just don't have any empirical evidence that our universe came into being from nothing. Science doesn't tell us what occurred before the Big Bang, or what was the what's his face name? Out of ex nihilo, nihilo fit. Out of nothing comes nothing. So,
Mhm.
what do you think of this empirical argument?
So when I'm looking at Big Bang cosmology, it is possibly consistent with creation ex nihilo, but I don't think it demands creation ex nihilo
Yeah.
because there's different things you need to do with how you interpret the singularity. Is the singularity an actual physical object? Is it a mathematical fiction? Is it just where all of our science breaks down? These are different ways you can interpret it. So it's possible you could have a Big Bang cosmology that's consistent with like a successive series of universes prior to our own, which would make the empirical evidence supposedly consistent with maybe something like what you would want. But I want to say that the consistency with the empirical data is not the only virtue that we're looking for with an empirical theory, because other theoretical virtues often come out to play that help us confirm, like if an empirical theory is good or not, such as the simplicity of the theory. So the ability to empirically confirm other aspects of eternal creation, I think, is going to be significantly weaker than creation ex nihilo on this point. And because an eternal creation has to posit a series of previous universes that in principle we cannot empirically study. So Michael Heller, in his work on universes and ultimate explanations, he points out that we have no way of knowing what happens after the end of one universe, nor any way of knowing what would make a universe rebound on itself in order to like hypothetically bring about the next Big Bang. Because anything that happens when you hit a singularity, everything breaks down. So anything and nothing, and like there's nothing that really follows from it, and everything follows from it. So you can't really make inferences even, and you can't empirically observe them. Further, I want to say that these sort of views where you got these cyclical universes, they go against things that we can empirically observe, such as the second law of thermodynamics. So
Hmm.
when I'm thinking of these kind of stuff, I'm like, what we can observe is going back to the singularity, and then things break down. Okay. And then we want to go with simpler hypotheses, the one that explains all the phenomena and is simpler than the other ones. So I don't need anything else to explain it. And the creation ex nihilo would do all of that. So it's like, yeah. So basically, here's my point. Does Big Bang get me to my view? No. My view is consistent with it, and my view explains it all, and I don't need anything else to explain it, to explain Big Bang. So it's certainly consistent with my view. And any other view that you posit, I would want to say that's unnecessary to explain what we do observe. And in principle, we couldn't empirically investigate these other views because of the way things break down at a singularity. I don't know if I explained that very well, but
Well, there's some parts I strongly disagree with, but I think
Mhm.
your ultimate point was that that the Big Bang doesn't prove creation out of nothing, but it's consistent with it. And I definitely want to say that my theory that God has everlastingly been creating can't be proved empirically as well. But the point I'm making here is that is an argument against creation out of nothing. It's not
Mhm.
an argument in favor of my view. And it's an argument that says everything we know in our experience empirically is something that has a prior cause. And so, why not just say that's an everlasting series? That seems more empirically supportable than saying nope. There was a particular there can be instances in the world in which something comes from nothing. Or just to use your previous statement about, what was it? Causes are always temporarily prior to effects.
Mhm.
Just taking that notion and saying, why don't we just extend our present experience because we don't have any empirical evidence that suggests that something can come from nothing. That's a little bit different argument than.
That is a little bit different argument. So this is good. Um, so when you're looking at the different accounts of tracing back to the singularity, if you take it to be a mathematical posit, if you take it to be an actual physical thing, whatever, it just raises that question. Well, what caused it? What was before it?
Mm,
And when you hit a singularity, you can't do any more empirical work at that point. So this is the point that Michael Heller is trying to bring out: is like everything and nothing follows from the singularity. So we're no longer in the realm of doing empirical science. We're now in the realm of having to do philosophy, which is cool because you and I are doing that. And so I'm like, right, the empirical point just brings us to this question: what was before it? And I'm like, there's God, nothing else. Cool. That's a pretty simple view. And if you want to go, there's a whole bunch of universes before that. I'm like, that's an interesting, complicated story. I need something to tell me why. So I don't think the empirical evidence goes against creation ex nihilo on this issue. And I don't think we could have empirical evidence for prior creations because the way things break down scientifically at the singularity.
yeah. I think we're actually closer on this than I originally thought
Mhm.
because I'm with you that empirical evidence is not going to deny creation out of nothing, and that's one of the things I admit to Bill Craig.
Mhm.
But my I'm repeating myself now.
It's okay.
My claim here is that it doesn't support it. And
Mhm.
so this is in a list of reasons why we should reject creation out of nothing.
Okay.
Uh, so anyway,
Yep.
maybe that might be one of our differences. Number 4. This one is really similar to my evil problem 8, I think, but it also has some similarities with 3. This is what I call the creation at an instant problem. We have no evidence that creatures or creature entities today can emerge instantaneously from absolute nothingness. So it's similar to the one that I just said because it's an empirical kind of a claim. But I'm tying it probably to the evil issue in my illustrations because if God is able to instantaneously bring something from nothing in the moment, then one would think that a loving God would do so sometimes to make the world a better place, prevent evil, etc.
Yeah. So when I was reading one of your earlier papers where you bring this one up, I couldn't tell what the claim was exactly. Like, is it that we have no evidence for things being brought into existence at an instant, or
Out of nothing from an instant.
out
Yeah.
of nothing from an instant? Okay. Well, then we could just go back to like the examples. Or I'm sorry. Okay. So here's the point where I went. So we have no experience of it, or we could have, in principle, have no evidence. Because one's weaker and one's stronger. So I'm trying to figure out which
Yeah.
one to.
Yeah. I wouldn't say in principle. I mean, that seems like too strong a claim, but we just don't know. We've never experienced that kind of thing.
Yeah. Um, so one point could be like, yeah, I haven't experienced a universe being brought into existence from a previous universe either. Oh well.
True.
So like, I'm not sure how much ground I'd be conceding if I go that way. The other way would go back to the conversation we started earlier, where I'm like, well, I brought a book into existence. Um, Again, not the physical parts, but the content, the ideas.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was that was pretty remarkable. I've done that what, four or five times now. You've done it a lot more than I have. Um,
That gets into a metaphysical distance between
it does.
abstractions and yeah, but
Yes. Yeah.
I think though, your responses to these, I think are good responses, um, but you are responding often with my own counter proposal in mind,
Hmm.
and I'm laying these things out not to say, yeah, well, and mine can
Oh, I
solve
see.
this. Boom.
Hmm.
I'm trying to get those who are advocates of creation out of nothing to say, look, here are the weaknesses of this approach here. And I'm sort of laying these things out. Now, it may be at the end of the day, after all, I put all the weaknesses on the table, they think my proposal has more weaknesses. So,
Sure.
they're still going to stick with
Yeah.
this. I'm going to argue otherwise, obviously. Uh,
Yeah,
so,
this is good. So
yeah,
let me clarify what I am up to because I didn't. So I'm working on this book, like I said earlier, on models of God and problems of creation. So one chapter I'm working on is looking at a bunch of different theories of creation and going, which one's the right one?
yeah,
Emanation from like Plotinus? That's super weird. Creation out of prime matter from Gersonides? Uh, there's this like prime matter that has no, it's material, but it doesn't take up any space. It has no properties. It's not
really
located
weird stuff.
anywhere, anywhen. And I'm like, that's
Yeah,
that's crazy. And then I look at Charles Hartshorne and this creation out of feeling, and it's these events of feeling that have no consciousness. And I'm like, feelings without consciousness? That lacks hardcore common sense. And David Griffin told me that process theism is built on hardcore common sense. So if that's like common sense, I should like to know what nonsense is. So I'm building up through these, going them off one by one, and then I get down to, okay, there's only two views left to consider: eternal creation and creation ex nihilo. So this is kind of my approach to this. Is when I'm looking at this, going, I know what the other contenders are, and I think they are wanting. So I really think the only contenders are you and I.
gotcha.
Yeah, so this is how I'm approaching this. Is these are
I'm
the only two
approaching
views
it.
worth considering.
Yeah, I'm approaching it similarly, but maybe not quite explicitly in the same way. Because in
Mhm.
one of, I don't know if did I send you one or two chapters of my book?
I think it's two
Maybe
chapters you sent ages
two.
ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you saw some of the stuff that I'm laying out. I've added
Hmm.
some new stuff on native or indigenous views, Australian, and those kinds of things. But anyway, let's keep
Hmm.
going since I'm
Yeah, yeah.
realizing our time is.
Sure.
Uh, Number five, this one you brought up Hartshorne. He's the first one who suggested this one,
Hmm.
the solitary power problem. Now you have a solitary God, at least prior to creation. This one says creation out of nothing assumes God once acted alone, but power only makes sense when understood in relation to others. So this one seems to, if we're going to bring up your particular take on creation out of nothing, this one kind of seems to be directed at you. What do you think of this one?
Hmm. So one reply a lot of people listening will probably go is, well, I believe in the Trinity, so it's like, there's these three. I got three people hanging about, so it's not that solitary. You could do that. I think it's unnecessary because I think there's this really basic metaphysical point. A substance has a power, and powers are dispositional. They can be exercised or manifested, or they could not be exercised or manifested. Like that's just what it is to have a power and what it means to exercise a power. You've got the power to bring about something. And I don't, and I so I can give a very standard metaphysical analysis of power, and I don't need anything social about it. So I don't understand Hartshorne's or a lot of these process people. I don't understand their point about it. It's always social, because I'm like, it's just a
Mm,
substance has a power, and a disposition is just like it could do something, or you don't do it. That's it.
yeah, well, I think this might be a bigger difference than I
Hmm.
realized because I think ontologically things don't have powers. I think things exert power.
We have to have power to be able to, and before you can exert it.
I think you have to be constituted by power, but when you say have power, it sounds like this thing's got a little bucket of power underneath the
Mhm.
left rib or something like that.
Yeah, it's a so there's different kinds of properties. Some are dispositional, some are not, and a power is typically like in this category of dispositional. So it's something that you could exercise or not exercise. So like think about your free will. You've got the ability to perform actions for a reason. Um, you don't always have to be doing it in order to have that power, that ability. I've got the ability to do lots of really cool social stuff. Create a kingdom, create a monarchy, create a egalitarian, some sort of Finnish, society. I've got these abilities, these powers. But if I don't exercise, I don't do anything with that power. That doesn't mean I don't have the power. I've got the power to, bench press 200 pounds right now. I'm not going to show off because I don't want to brag, but I've got the power to do it. I don't have to be doing things in order to have the power. The power
Mm,
is prior to the exercise of the power.
yeah. I think this is the difference between us that I
Mhm.
didn't realize. Yeah. I would say you don't have the power to bench press, but I would use the abilities language, and I think the
Hmm.
abilities is an abstraction that references the powers of activity moment by moment. But that's interesting. Yeah, because in
What's the
your
difference
view,
between a power and an ability?
well, ability is the capacity to do something, whereas
Hmm.
I'm thinking of power is the actually doing of the thing.
Okay.
So powers wouldn't be capacities because, um, yeah, that's the difference between the
Okay.
abstraction and the actual
So
acting
let's
of
stick
something.
with that. Then so say so the argument couldn't be abilities are essentially social. So I don't know how the argument's supposed to go because I guess I would just say then God has the ability to create a universe out of nothing. Okay, so now what's the problem?
Yeah,
I hadn't thought about it this way, but do you see what I'm saying here? Like I don't know how to re-articulate your argument now.
yeah. Yeah, so I think if we use that language, I should grant to you divine abilities, assuming God can create, can exist
Sure.
out of nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
But if I'm using powers in the way that I'm using it, and it's always power is always in relation to something else, God doesn't have the power, but God has the ability in your view.
Yeah.
So maybe this is a semantic sort of a sticking point
Right.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Let's keep going.
All right. I think this one I'm most interested because you were the one who first pushed me onto my sixth one, what I call the timeless creator problem. Um,
Mm-hmm.
theologians who claim God is timeless before creating the universe ex nihilo can't account for how a timeless God timefully acts when creating. Now, you're going to get around this by saying God has one moment of time, or is it this one single moment, which I have
Mm-hmm.
really hard times with. But yeah, this is one that I got from you.
Mm-hmm.
How would you respond?
Well, I mean, response is it is impossible for a timeless being to create a universe out of nothing. And I just don't know of any way out of that. I have written 2 books and like dozens of articles, and I don't know of any way. Um, I think that all the responses I'm aware of either are just unintelligible or really implausible. So now a lot of people listening who are like, but I like my timelessness and I like my creation out of nothing. Ryan, why are
Yeah.
you stabbing me in the back right now? And I'm like, sorry, bro. Um, that's my only response is yeah, sorry.
So let's lay out four options here.
Okay.
One is a timeless God. You and I reject that, and you and
Mhm.
I are strongly think that that's an impossible view. So
Mhm.
I'll put this on one side. Then let's put my view on the other side, as a God who's always been creating. So this, there's always time, a sequence of the divine life.
Mhm.
Then there seems like there's two intermediate possibilities between those. One is your view, a God who has one moment of time, who's
Mhm.
not timeless, but somehow it's one moment and then enters into a series of moments.
Mhm.
And then someone like maybe Bill
Like
Hasler,
Craig.
but I'll say uh, I think William Lane Craig's actually an instance of the first one since he's
Oh
got
yeah,
a
yeah,
timeless God.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's timeless prior to.
Yeah, this other one I think between the two is a notion of Trinitarian relations. So you got not a God in one moment, but a God who's experiencing time, and the otherness that God is experiencing is within the divine life. So, Father, Son, Spirit are everlastingly exchanging love within
Mhm.
Trinity. Now, I don't like that view because it sounds like tritheism to me, but
Mhm.
that would be one option to have that goes beyond, that is an alternative to your God of one moment
Mhm.
prior to the universe. Um, Thoughts on that scenario?
Yeah. So you've got this view. Leibniz actually rejects this view. So he's looking at Isaac Newton and Samuel Clarke. And so Isaac Newton and Samuel Clarke want to affirm that God creates the universe out of nothing. The universe has an absolute beginning. But they also have this view where time it just necessarily flows from moment to moment to moment to moment to moment.
Hmm.
And and so you've got this infinite series of moments prior to creation. And Leibniz is like, okay, God's perfectly rational, right? And you're like, yeah, of course, of course. He's like, so he always does something for a reason. Of course, of course. Why did he create the universe then instead of like earlier or later?
Yeah, yeah,
What reason could you have? And Clark's response is like, any time is just as good as any other. So why not? Like, he just doesn't care. Whereas I'm a bit more bothered by it. And I think if you have this sort of Trinitarian view where there's all this mutual love and back and forth going on prior to creation, I think you're going to get into the same kind of problem of going,
I agree.
why did the triune persons create then instead of earlier or later?
You overcome that in your way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to agree with this, but
sure. Yeah.
You think you overcome that by saying, well, my God of one moment, there isn't an earlier or later because there's just the one moment. So you're kind of
Correct.
getting out of it by saying, well, we don't have a series, so we can't. That question, you're like Augustine. That that doesn't. There is no such thing as a moment before God's one moment.
Right. So what was God doing before the universe? I have a better answer, I think, than Augustine, because I'm like, well, God was just hanging out, contemplating what do I want to create, and plotting to take over the world. So I do have a before.
You can't say that, can you?
There's a before.
Yeah, but contemplating is a sequential time activity, and you've got a God with one moment.
So one of the things I'm open to, I've written a little bit on this in a couple papers. So I'm looking at these debates between Calvinists and Mollinists, where they're like, there's these logical moments in the life of God, to try to like capture how he somehow timelessly, all at once, yet sequentially thinks through things. And I'm like, you pile up eternal contradictions into the life of God. That's bad. Don't do that. What you get out of it is if you just go, well, maybe the Molinist says there's 3 logical moments in the life of God, but then when you start pushing them harder, you get like 8 logical moments, and you're like, that's more than you promised me. And I'm like, I know the Calvinists do the same thing. They're like, there's only 2, but actually there's like 18. And you're like, what? It gets nuts. And so I'm like, if you guys really want this kind of deliberation, divine deliberation prior to creation, you're going to need a series of moments. You're still going to get back to that single like first moment, but you're going to have to introduce a series to really capture divine deliberation. But how many people actually want the deliberation is what I find odd, because you've got someone like William Lane Craig, who is in his Systematic, volume 2. He's like, God deliberates. It's ultimate deliberation when he's talking about Molinism. And then 100 pages later, he goes, God doesn't deliberate. And I'm like, do you want deliberation or not? So I think there's some problems here with a lot of theologians on this.
Mm-hmm. But I'm not hearing how you get around it.
So if I want deliberation and I'm strongly inclined for deliberation, then I'm like, okay, fine. There's this first moment. It never began to exist. And then subsequently to that moment, God deliberates for a while. I don't know how many moments that is. And once the deliberation comes to an end, then he creates. So why does God create at that when he does? The answer would be because that's when the deliberation stopped. And the only next possible moment to create is the one right after when deliberation stops. So think about Molinism. The first moment is natural knowledge. So that's the first moment of reality. So God knows his own essence, his own nature. And he's like, here's all the things I could do. The second moment is God deliberating over these hypothetical scenarios, all the middle knowledge kind of stuff.
Right.
And he's like, yeah, that's what like Tom would actually do if he was placed in this situation. Okay. The next moment is him going free knowledge, which is him actually making the decision of going, I want that one. And then the fourth moment would be actually freely bringing it about.
And so that would be logical moments.
I would, if you're going to be a temporalist, in order to avoid all this eternal contradiction stuff, I think you've got to drop the logical moments and make them temporal. Yeah, so it'd be 4 moments or 3 moments leading up to creation. The fourth moment would be creation itself.
Yeah. I think that's adding all kinds of extraneous stuff, but
it does. And that's why I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This is taking longer than I thought it would.
It's all right. It's all right.
I can't help myself. The errant revelation problem. A God who can create something from nothing could probably guarantee an inerrant revelation, but we have good evidence no inerrant revelation exists. So, what do you think of that one?
I found this one really interesting because there's a lot of people who want to go, we do have an inerrant revelation. So everybody who signs up for the Chicago Statement of Faith, which I somehow didn't know this thing existed until I got to seminary. I was able to go through Bible college without ever hearing about it because my denomination's like, what? And then you've got, of course, a lot of thinkers in Islam who are like, we have an inerrant revelation. What are you talking about, Tom? And even like there's these different like Jainist and Buddhist debates about, no, we have the real inerrant revelation. So there'd be a bunch of people who would say, Tom, we do have one. And some of those, the Muslims, for example, and some of the Christians are going to say, we have an inerrant revelation, and God did create the universe out of nothing. So cool. But I've got this other pushback, though, which is I don't see the connection between creating out of nothing and inerrant revelation. Could God create an inerrant revelation? Yeah, that seems logically possible to me. But would it fit with the goal of entering into friendship with humans? Because I think there's this weird, delicate balance that God has to engage in if he's going to try to enter into relationships with humans, where he cannot make things too obvious. Otherwise, that would coerce us. And I know you don't like coercion. So I think in an inerrant revelation that was really obvious, obviously inerrant, that might coerce a lot of people. And so the friendship would not be entered into freely. It would be coerced. So there might be reasons to build in to go, there's no systematic connection between creating out of nothing, therefore inerrant revelation.
Yeah, boy, there's all kinds of assumptions.
I know it's a lot. Yeah. Yeah.
That I'm not on board with, but I can see your argument. And of course, since I think they're obvious errors, all those people who think there aren't, I'm not going to take them very seriously.
Yeah, you don't want to take them on. That's fine.
Yeah. All right. So finally to number 8, the number one reason that got me into this whole thing, Ryan, the problem of evil. If God can omnipotently create from absolute nothing, this deity would be culpable for failing to use that ability to prevent genuine evil. Here, are you going to appeal to the God can't be too obvious and God needs some bad stuff and that sort of stuff, or what do you think?
It's a bit more complex than that. So you had this argument. Yeah, obviously, yeah. So for people who have not read your Pluriform Love book, I think it was where I got it from, the Pluriform Love book, you have an argument very similar to David Lewis's argument, which is things like the free will defense. Like that just doesn't work. Why does it not work? A few different reasons. We do not take into consideration the free actions of agents when we're thinking about like what sort of like moral actions we should perform. So if I see like a serial killer, gonna run around, I don't care about his free will, and so I'm going to take action against him. So these cannot be part of the considerations when we're doing this. And is that exactly, that was close to one of the arguments you ran, right?
I'm not sure I'm not sure. So keep going.
Okay, keep going. So because I guess it's the claim is this: like, if a bullet's coming towards me, why doesn't God just snap his fingers and create a brick wall between me and there? And people are like, oh, the free will of the agent. And some of the arguments are, well, we don't take into consideration these things. My response to that is to go, we do all the time. So we're Americans, so we care about freedom, right? I live really close to Freedom Avenue, which is an actual street in Philadelphia, which just still tickles me. We do constantly, in our laws and in our practices, we do take into consideration the freedom of others when we're trying to figure out the moral thing to do. So the freedom and the autonomy of other people is a consideration in our overall deliberation of what actions we perform. So I think when it comes to the problem of evil, there's a few considerations that God has to take to think about. One is his goal for creation, how to achieve that goal, and then the network of obligations he has. So I think one of the network of obligations that he has is to maintain a universe where the sort of freedom and autonomy that's necessary to enter into friendship with him, he has to maintain those things in existence. And if he does anything that undermines that too much, then that's going against his own goal. So if he were to say, do something like this. So every time a bullet flies at someone, God snaps his fingers, puts a brick wall up between you and the bullet. Every time that happens, God does that. That would become like a law of nature, basically. There would be so much law-like regularity that humans would quickly learn we can't do that. And you can start doing this for a whole bunch of cases of really horrible things that are happening. And And so it would be God's hand would be so obvious in creation that it would undermine any of our abilities to develop our character, to freely exercise our wills, these sorts of things. So I think it's a knock-on effect. So I think God has a certain network of obligations to maintain a particular kind of universe. Otherwise, it would get into the area of like coercion.
Yeah, I don't find those arguments
No, I knew you
satisfying,
wouldn't.
but I'm gonna do a honorary response to you. All right.
Mhm,
Suppose you gave that argument to Emmy and you said, I
mhm,
really don't want to make my love for you obvious here.
mhm,
Otherwise, you might be just so compelled to be so kind and fall in love with me. So
mhm,
I'm going to allow some crap stuff to happen to you just so I'm sure that I'm not coercing you into your love.
mhm.
That doesn't sound quite right to me.
No, and it wouldn't, because there are differences between humans and creatures, or humans and God. One of the differences between God and humans is God is morally perfect. So the possibility of failing to love, that's just not going to be there. The
Yeah.
possibility of me failing to love, oh my gosh, that's pretty high. Like it just is not always obvious. And she's like, Emma walks in, she's like, "Why didn't you take out the trash?" And I'm like, "Ah, yeah, yeah." Like there's lots of opportunities where my love is not obvious because of the moral failures that I have. So,
But doesn't
so I
that
think there's.
argument, oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead. Go ahead.
Doesn't that argument actually backfire though? Because like I would think God would have greater incentive to say that my love is steadfast. Perfect. Ryan, yeah, he
Hmm.
sucks. At least
Hmm.
sometimes he sucks. Other times he's good, but sometimes he sucks. But I want to show you that my love is perfect, that I'll never fail, that I'll do the utmost to rescue you when things are bad, to encourage you, to celebrate you when things are good. Don't you think God has extra incentive to stop bullets in midair or whatever to show the steadfastness of God's love?
I don't think so, because when I'm trying to think through of like, if I'm God and I'm all powerful, I'm omnipresent, how do I really create the right conditions where creatures can freely enter into a friendship with me? Like, how can they really be able to go yes or no, or how do they step away? And if I'm omnipresent and like you're just fully aware of me all the time, how could you meaningfully like step away or say no to God? I don't know how you could do that. So I do think divine hiddenness has to be one of the requisite conditions for for a universe where creatures could freely enter into God, because of the kind of being God is. So God's going to want to have moments where He tries to make that steadfast love visible to us. But again, if it's too obvious, overwhelming for all of humanity, then I don't know how to do that without making the relationship coerced.
Yeah.
So I can give these one-off kind of cases, but I would start thinking like, well, if I'm God, like if I'm doing this like every single instant, now the creatures are just going to be like, well, I have to follow this guy over here. I can't do anything
Yeah.
else.
And of course, I'm sure you know the problem with that argument of if I do it all the time, then I'm going to have a problem because then the response is quickly, well, then God must be not ever doing that, and
Mhm.
therefore there's no miracles. And I'm guessing you're not going to want to go that route. So
Yeah,
then you're going to have to say, well, it's rational for God to do it this time, and then we're back to this sort of the mystery of
correct.
God's rationality. And anyway.
Yeah. Mhm,
So I
mhm.
don't think we're going to make headway on that one. So
No,
let's go
not
to
today.
number.
Not today. Yeah.
I respect your intellect. I just disagree with you on
Yeah.
those. We're going to skip 9. Oh, and 10 I've already kind of addressed, but maybe you want to say more. And that is the
Mhm,
Bible doesn't endorse creation out of nothing. The writers say God creates out of something: water, deep, chaos, invisible things, muck and mire. Um, I'm guessing I know the Bible matters to you,
mhm.
but you're not a sort of a, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it, it's got to go kind of thing. So how do you deal with this one?
Yeah, so I agree that a lot of the biblical passages are ambiguous. So I don't think Genesis 1, for example, I don't think that's a knockdown, like therefore obviously creation out of nothing. I just don't see it. But the ambiguity there, I don't think automatically goes in a direction of chaos either, because it's like in the beginning there was God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and I'm like, well, it doesn't look like out of chaos or anything. But and then when I look at Psalm 90, this one I find I don't understand why Psalm 90 does not play a bigger role in the debates over creation out of nothing. This one baffles me, because Psalm 90 says, before the foundations of the world, before heaven and earth and all that jazz, from olam to olam, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So from a really, really long time to a really, really long time, before all that other stuff, there was God. And I'm like, that looks like you've just got God just hanging out for a while, and then all the stuff comes into existence. And that fits nicely with a lot of the pre-existent passages you see in the New Testament, related to like predestination and foreknowledge, the prior existence of Christ and all that. But yeah, this one, I mean, I'm like, it's not a creation out of something. It's before the foundations of the world, before the heavens and the earth, there's God.
Yeah. Well,
And it's a
obviously,
literal temporal before as well. That's what it, yeah.
yeah. My view can obviously handle that easily, so that's not a difference between the two of us. But I think what the objection would be is that those passages don't explicitly endorse creation out of nothing. They say God was present before the foundation of the world, but that's different than saying, yeah, and God created it all from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think also you started your response. I think this one I have a much stronger case than you're giving me credit for.
Okay. Okay.
Because you saw in the text that I just quote biblical scholar after biblical scholar, and people not with a sort of a paycheck to make them believe one way or another,
Sure.
that that say the Bible doesn't have creation out of nothing. Genesis 1 isn't ambiguous to the biblical scholars I create. There's something there. So
Mm-hmm.
I think I've got a stronger case than you're giving me credit for when you say, well, it's
Yeah.
kind of ambiguous here.
You do quote a lot of biblical scholars who very clearly be like, it's just not here. Bruce Waltke, he's someone who would go, there's some ambiguity, but it's not like completely against creation. So there are others who would disagree, but you do cite a lot of very serious biblical scholars who go, yeah, it's just not here. So yeah, you're right to bring this up to the audience. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right, well, let's go to the one that I thought would be nice to add, even
Mm-hmm.
though you kind of had some hesitations. And this was what I called the ecological problem. A God, and this is the last one, viewers,
Mm-hmm.
listeners, so we're finally getting to the end. A God who can create something from nothing could prevent ecological disasters or make another world to replace this one. Creatio ex nihilo, therefore, demotivates us in our love of the earth and sacrifice for the sake of the world. And I think in the email you sent earlier, you kind of thought, well, that's just another version of the problem of evil. But here I want to do a little tweak
Mm-hmm.
on this. So um, our mutual friend Tim Mawson, I'm quoting him in another part of my systematic theology on the question of whether or not God can annihilate creation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he takes a more traditional view. At least I've read it other places, but he says it explicitly. So I cite him
Mm-hmm.
that, yep, God sustains the world. God can up and annihilate it. Boom, just like that, if God wants to. And if that's the case, um, it seems like God could just up and create a new world that doesn't have the ecological problems that at least humans have contributed to, if not the main contributors. And it seems to demotivate lots of other things. It seems to make this life and world less consequential overall than if God, in my view, can't
Mm-hmm.
annihilate, simply can't. There's not an option for God's part. So if we add in that annihilation thing, what do you think of that aspect?
Yeah, I've got some different axiological intuitions than Mawson does on these points. Because when Tim's trying to figure out why would God create anything at all and why this particular kind of universe, his answer is humans are pretty cool, like really valuable. And so humanity is like the crown jewel of the universe. And the analogy he gives is God's creating like a ring, and then like you place a diamond in it, and so the universe is the ring and humanity is the diamond. And he has all these arguments. There's a bunch of stuff in the universe that just has no intrinsic value at all, like bacteria
Mm,
and like this kind of stuff. I want to reject this. I want to affirm the great chain of being. So
yeah.
the great chain of being is you've got God at the top, is the most valuable, the greatest thing possible, and on down are all the possible things that could exist that God could produce, and everything on the great chain of being has some degree of value. So I think the main answer to the question, why would God create anything at all, is to bring about values that would otherwise not exist. When it
Mm.
comes to answering why would God create this particular universe, I want to say, well, one of the reasons is to enter into friendship with humanity, because that's a pretty cool thing to do. So that helps narrow down why this set of valuable things instead of this other set of valuable things. But I don't think it's the only reason God creates the universe. Here's why. So Moses Maimonides, he has this really funny thought experiment where one of the answers to why would God create anything at all is for the Jewish people. And Maimonides is like, we're pretty cool, but like, what about those cows out there? What about the grass? Like this
Mm.
this world's really, really big. Did God need to create all of that just for the Jewish people? Like that seems unnecessary. And Maimonides is pushing this point to go, maybe these other things have value too. And I think that's right. So when I look at the story of Job, like, or not, sorry, Jonah. Remember how Jonah ends, where Jonah's like really mad at God, and he's like, God, why didn't you destroy Nineveh? Like, what's up? And he's like, well, there's a lot of people there, and there's cattle too. For some reason, that always made me laugh as a kid. I'm like, as an adult now, I'm thinking, okay, no, that's right. The grass is there, the cattle is there, all the things are there. Why? Because they have intrinsic value. So
Mm.
that's why they're there. They also have instrumental value in
Yeah.
terms of being able to bring about things higher up on the great chain of being, but they have value in and of themselves. So when God creates a universe out of nothing, he's like, those things, I want them there because they have value. And the way these things interact, yeah, they can bring about natural disasters, they can bring about ecological catastrophes, but some of those things are what clears the path for things higher up the great chain of being to come into existence. So I think there's a lot of really cool, amazing, valuable things going on there. So I guess here's my disagreement with Tim Austin is on this point, and because there's a disagreement here, I don't see how creation ex nihilo logically entails that I wouldn't be able to say we should fight climate change and fight against these things, because I'm like, it all has value.
Yeah, not logically. I'm not making a
Right.
logical argument. I'm making sort of a psychological one. Like,
Yeah.
if climate change it continues to occur, and if things get as bad as what some people think they're going to get,
Mhm.
then what would demotivate? Why wouldn't God just up and say, okay, you guys sucked. I'm starting over.
Yeah.
We're going to do another Noah in
Yeah.
the Ark sort of story here.
Exactly. Take two. Let's try again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm happy to hear you talk about the intrinsic value of creatures. I mean, that's
Mhm.
something near and dear to my heart. I don't,
Yeah.
I'm not a great Chain of Being fan, but earlier you gave as one of your main motivators for God to create the idea of friendship, and I was assuming that would be with humans or at least complex creatures. But now it
Complex
sounds like,
creatures. Yeah.
yeah, now it sounds like you're expanding that to include other creatures of intrinsic value that maybe God don't have the capacity for at least conscious friendship with God. Would that be true?
Mhm. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Because when you read Eternal in Love, I was not satisfied. Well, because I start out the book saying, "Here's what I think about God right now," which, because it's true, it's what I thought about God right now, and I was like, "That's going to change," and I wasn't fully satisfied, and so I'm trying to expand the answer, because the answer to why God would create it all, I didn't. I thought I got the basic framework there, but not enough details. So the fuller details are things have intrinsic value, and God's like, that's a reason to create them.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well,
So yeah.
those are the 11. I got a kind of a summary statement that I want to make, but Tyson,
Cool.
what are you thinking in terms of where we go now?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and give a summary statement, we're going to get into Q&A in just a second, but if
Mhm.
you guys want to kind of both give summary statements before we get into that, that'd be fine.
Yeah, part of my summary is it's sort of a re-saying, a retelling of what my aim was, and
Mhm.
that is to give a cumulative case for why a different view of creation, other than creation out of nothing, the idea that God has always been creating out of that which God previously created, motivated by love, yada yada yada, all the stuff that I said. Um, I I like in when I do debates, which is what this was supposed to be. I like to point out aspects of my opponent's argument that I think is the strongest, even if I don't find it overall convincing. Um, I think, or at least if it's not part of the arguments, at least arguments that could be made. Ryan didn't really push hard the argument from tradition, and that is that so many Christian theologians and Muslims and Jews, but especially Christians, have been advocates of creation out of nothing in various versions. Um, and even though historical and tradition isn't the most important thing to me, I do think that's one of the obstacles my view has to face, that I don't have the tradition, the majority in the tradition on my side. Also, I think one of my biggest obstacles is that the view I'm proposing um, is difficult for people to get their head around. And even though creation out of nothing, I think, is equally, if not more difficult to get your head around, people are used to that language and they're used to toying with the notions and looking at the positives and negatives. But my proposal that God everlastingly is creating out of that which God previously created, people just aren't used to pondering that one. So one of the debt, or one of the obstacles I'm facing, is just the novelty of my position. But then finally, I think my view, which in my view, in my way of thinking, emphasizes persuasive rather than non-coercive love, um, is going to be perceived by some folks as implicitly making God less powerful and less free. That in the minds of many people, God who can create something out of nothing has got to be more powerful than a God who's always creating in relation to God, that which God previously created. And a God who must create because it's God's nature to do so is not going to be as free as a God who could decide not to create if God wanted to. Um, I'm willing to bite the bullet on both those issues because I think the advantages of my position outweigh those two, at least responses of seemingly less powerful and less free God. But I just want to acknowledge that those are things that I encounter in arguments. Ryan didn't really come out strong on either. I guess the freedom, he started off with that one. But I want to acknowledge that even though I think my proposal's better overall than creation out of nothing and in general in Ryan's particular view, I recognize that there are some drawbacks and obstacles that it faces.
Okay. And Ryan, did you have a summary you wanted to give of yours?
Sure, I can give a brief summary.
Sure.
So yeah, the tradition argument, it's I did not bring it up, but I've got it written down in my book manuscript. So one of the things I point out is when you're looking historically at this debate between eternal creation and creation out of nothing, people like Maimonides, Sagigon, and Thomas Aquinas, they'll say our faith and our tradition, they affirm creation out of nothing. And so that is a very common argument you will see in favor of the view that I've tried to defend today. Um, the reason I don't push that one as hard is because I know that historically there was a lot of people affirming not exactly Tom's view, but something in the neighborhood. So many people that it became a big controversy at a whole bunch of different points in history. So that's why I wanted to go, let's look at some of these other arguments instead. But the historical point matters to a lot of people, so it's worth pointing out. So I am trying to defend a view that has had a very dominant position within Christian thought and within a lot of Jews and a lot of Islamic thought as well. The biblical arguments I don't think are as strong as I would like them to be, but I do think that, again, Psalm 90 is one that I think people need to reflect on more, which I still find odd that it hasn't been a central point of focus in these debates. The view that I want to affirm, I think, follows quite clearly from some basic logical principles, like all causes are prior to their effects. If God's going to produce something, he's going to have to be prior to it. So he's going to be without that thing. I don't quite understand a lot of the details of how Tom's view is supposed to work. Some of those I'm waiting to see when the new systematic comes out. When I'm looking at some previous thinkers who have views in the neighborhood, I've got a lot of questions about it, which is why I find the creation ex nihilo position more plausible. But there are weird things related to it because you've got God and then God producing a bunch of material stuff. And so a lot of people do have worries like, how do you get no material and immaterial. It doesn't bother me too much, but I want to acknowledge that that is a weird, an oddity of the view. And then I guess I should close by pointing out some common ground. So I do think that if you affirm creation ex nihilo, you've got a more robust account of divine freedom to a point than on Tom's view, because God is free to create or not create. But historically, a lot of very traditional theologians, when they start saying, like, once God creates, then he doesn't have the freedom to do a whole lot of stuff because he is locked in to following through with a particular course of action. So all these other, like, ability to do like this or that, like that just kind of goes out the window because God's focused on bringing about his goal for creation. That's not terribly far off from Tom's view of where God has to create because he's loving, and then he can't do a whole bunch of stuff because that would just go against his love. So there's more common ground, I think, on divine freedom than might people might typically see. But I still think there's a lot more freedom I could find, but we didn't get into that. But I want to say there's more common ground, I think, between Tom's view and what a lot of other theologians have traditionally said. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'll just stop there. Just saying, there's common ground. There's some disagreements. If it turns out Tom's right, I don't think it's the end of the world. I don't think it ruined or it sinks Christianity by any stretch of the imagination, because it would be like God created some more stuff than you thought. Therefore, Christianity's it still seems true to me. So yeah, so I think it's an important debate, but let's put it in perspective, like how important it is.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. It's been a super rich discussion so far. You guys got into some technical weeds, which I greatly appreciate. And, if you're watching this live, this is your last chance to submit a comment or question in order to get entry into our book giveaway. So go ahead and submit those now. And let's go ahead and bring in, also, if you appreciate conversations like this, we have several more lined up throughout the year on some really interesting topics. So if this is the type of discussion that stimulates you and you're interested in, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, tap the notification bell so you get updates on all of our upcoming talks. I would love to have you guys back on for discussion of Tom's Systematic when it comes out. And I was talking to Tom earlier about maybe getting an autographed copy so we can do some giveaways of that as well. I think that would be a really fascinating discussion. So looking forward to that. So yeah, let's go ahead and bring in some of the questions people have submitted on both YouTube and Facebook. The first one we have here is from Chris Stockman. He asks, Dr. Oord, would it be more accurate to describe your view as assembling rather than creating? When I hear create, I immediately think of something not existing and then existing.
Love it. Yeah. Yeah, my view has everything that is created is something new. And I was thinking today, anticipating this question because I get it a lot. I was thinking, okay, I got to come up with some really good analogies so it'll help people to understand what I'm saying. And I thought of this because my grandkids were over last night. I think some people hear my view and they think that the God who is creating is kind of like baking a cake. When you bake a cake, you got to have the eggs, the flour, the sugar, whatever. You got to have these materials. And then what comes out, well, yeah, that's new, it's different, but isn't it just kind of rearranging and some of those things changing somewhat? But basically, a cake is just flour, eggs, sugar, and whatever else goes into it. And so I think sometimes people jump to the conclusion that that's the kind of God I'm creating. But I think the better analogy is this one. When your parents had sex and that sperm hit the egg, the fetus that emerged is really radically different from the sperm and the egg that came prior to it. And yet, they were the materials that brought about you as a fetus and then you as an older person. I think that's a better analogy because it better suggests that, we don't think that the fetus is just a rearranging of an egg and a sperm, right? Even though there's chromosomes and things that are involved. We think there's something genuinely new that comes about. And that new thing is continually influenced, in my view, by God, but almost in everybody's view, by other nature, and there's some self causation involved. So, if you're thinking about my view and you're worried it's just rearranging, assembling materials in a different way, you think about the sex analogy rather than the cake analogy.
I I don't know if that analogy helps because
Oh,
on your view, like, why is there material stuff?
yeah,
The answer is God,
yes.
like, wanted it to exist, right?
That's
So
part of the answer. Yeah, yeah. It's not just
so
God, but yeah,
well, that's I guess that's the part I don't understand how it couldn't be just God. Yeah, this is where I get confused in terms of like trying to figure out what the ultimate explanation is, because I don't think your view is assembly, because it's supposed to be God's like the ultimate ground of reality, and the explanation for why all this stuff exists is because like, well, God loves, and love just entails he wants these things.
yeah.
Um,
Well,
so
I
yeah, I
think
was
of
thinking God's more fundamental than the sex analogy.
um. Oh, well, that last line threw me
On
just.
your view, I was thinking God would have to be more fundamental than what the sex analogy could really
Okay.
illuminate.
Yeah. Well, I do think God is more fundamental than that analogy. There's always going to be a problem with analogies when we're talking about in
Sure.
this way. But I was thinking that the assembly worry was that stuff really doesn't much change, and you just have a mixing of things in different ways. And I was trying to emphasize the novelty and spontaneity.
Hmm.
But this is going to ruin my not ruin my it's going to change my analogy some,
Hmm.
but let's go to the egg and sperm one. you know let's say God is the sperm and then there's the egg there. The problem with the analogy is the sperm stops doing its thing and being what it is when the fetus grows, and I think God continually influences. But the reason I'm bringing it up is that in that conception, it's not just the sperm that brings about the fetus. There's also the egg. And so, in as you know from my view of creating, even though God's everlasting in creating, God never creates as a sufficient cause in any moment. There's always creaturely others that are also playing causal roles. So that's what I was trying to do with my analogy.
Yeah, I just don't understand where they're coming from, because if I've got the tweaked analogy that you have, it's not like the like where did the egg come from? Like, I
Yeah.
thought God's supposed to explain like kind of where the egg came from too.
Yes.
So I'm just, I guess, so here's like some people who would push this kind of objection in the past. There's a guy named like Farnell in like early 1900s, and then you see some other people in the Middle Ages. So John Peacham, who was one of the people who weighed in on these debates, he gives something almost identical to what Chris gives, where he's like, creation just means it's not there, and then it comes into existence. And so he just wants to dismiss like this whole like tradition of eternal creation, because he's like, that's just not creation, that's just sustaining. um, where does the stuff come from? And so that's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, you're like, well, yeah, there's some stuff there, God's producing it with that, and I'm like, but where'd that stuff come from? And you're like,
Yeah.
well, God was it. So like, I'm worried I'm never getting an ultimate explanation of how all
Well,
this stuff gets there.
yeah, I mean, there's not going to be an ultimate explanation of where stuff in general comes from, other than saying God creates it in relation to something. But then you're going to
Mhm.
say, well, where'd that something come from? And then I'm going to say,
Right.
well, God created in relation to something. And so it's going to be a metaphysical ultimate kind of a scenario. I'm going to just appeal to, well, it's the same answer I give for where did God come from? Well, God, you
Mhm.
just sort of start there. Except in my scenario, we're starting with a God who creates from things that God previously created. That's the metaphysical starting point. So,
Okay.
yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to account for that, because I have a certain metaphysical ultimacy that presupposes God's been always creating out of that which God previously created.
Yeah. I've got questions on that, but we need to get to the, yeah, sorry, we got to get, Tyson's got stuff lined up.
Yeah. Yeah. So I didn't use a clickbait title for this video or discussion, but now in hindsight, now that we've brought up sex, I
Mhm.
should have made it like God creation and procreation or
Mhm.
something like that.
Ooh, there you go.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah. All right. So thanks, Chris, for the question. Next is J.M. Paulo Perez, one of our buddies in the Philippines. Again, for Dr. Oord, he says Lawrence Krauss argued for a universe from nothing via quantum fluctuations. Do you believe this? Or I'm guessing he's saying, well, if you can get a universe from nothing and quantum fluctuations, then what does that mean for your everlasting creation model?
Yeah, I think Walter Heisenberg has some similar language. I've read some of Lawrence Krauss's stuff and not been that impressed with them. Often, and here I don't want to, since I haven't read all of Lawrence Krauss's stuff, I'll just say make a generalization. Often scientists make metaphysical claims in a kind of naive way. And if you press them on, do you really mean from nothing? Then they're going to come back with, well, not actually absolute nothing, but I mean, that's pretty close to it or something like that. So I don't know quite how to account for Lawrence Krauss's views, but I don't think quantum fluctuations can literally bring something from nothing.
Yeah, and it should be noted that Krauss has been excoriated by his
Yeah.
peers for
Is that
his
right?
Yeah.
philosophically naive take on the concept of nothing. So,
Okay, good.
yeah,
My intuitions were right on that one.
yeah,
Yeah, you were way more gentle than a lot of people had been.
yeah, yeah. All right. So, Mylan Freed said, "I'd love to hear thoughts on why love hasn't been very central in the history of Christian thought. Sociological power structures, for example. Also, a question for all three of you: pancakes or waffles? Let's take that one first. So, pancakes or waffles, guys?
Pancakes. I think pancakes are better.
I'll go with either one as long as I can put chocolate chips in them.
Oh, all right.
Okay.
Yeah,
You just
I'm
need the
also a
vehicle.
pancake guy.
There we go.
I'd kind of
Good
like
deal.
to hear Ryan's take on this question since I've written so much on it. I want to hear what he thinks.
Yeah. So I'm in the process of like identifying a bunch of different thinkers from that affirm different models of God. And I'm talking classical, neoclassical, open theist, and panentheist. I've all found who want to say love cannot be the explanation. There's a few different reasons. Here's one of the strongest ones. They'll say when you're trying to think about God creating something, you have to think about God before that thing comes into existence. And you can't love something that doesn't exist. So love can't be the motive
Mm.
for why that thing exists. And I'm like, what's your definition of love? And the answer is,
Mm.
I don't know, bro. I'm not going to tell you. That's like the
Exactly.
biggest one. And this is what annoys me so much. So when I first started thinking about love and it came across Tom's work, like maybe like 2010, 2011, something like this, I was like, finally, someone's acknowledging that like this is a problem that no one's defining like just really obvious terms. But what I keep coming across is love cannot be the explanation because something has to exist for you to love it. And then they don't really give me a definition of love. Whereas I think if you give a definition of love, here's just one. I know Tom doesn't fully get on board with this one, but love involves valuing the existence, the flourishing, and some kind of unity with that thing. I think that's part of the story of love is you're valuing this other object. And so you could love something that doesn't exist yet. So you're wanting to have a kid and you perform a bunch of actions to prepare for that kid to come about. Um, do I want to so like because Tyson, you just had a kid like somewhat recently, right? So
Indeed.
yeah, so you and your wife, you made a room, you did all this stuff to prepare for it and everything, and I want to go, yeah, you weren't being loving that entire time. Like that just sounds nuts to me. I'm like, no, you're performing actions that are trying to promote the existence of this child. You're performing actions that are trying to promote the flourishing of this child because you know what's coming, and you're trying to perform actions that are going to set the stage to be unified with this child. That sounds like a loving action to me. So I think if people just start actually defining their terms, then the main reason for love not being a big, this at least like a stated reason for why love has not played a bigger role. I think that just goes out the window.
Okay.
I'll throw.
Yeah.
Can I throw
Good.
two in there real quick? And I think both these are implicit rather than sort of stated in formal argument. One's more charitable and one's less charitable, but both of them are implicit. The less charitable one is I just think lots of theologians are um, really fascinated by power, and they want a God who's in control. They want a God who can guarantee things will work out. So the less charitable one is that too many theologians have been enamored with power instead of love. The more charitable one, and probably less common, and again also implicit, I think uh, is the analogy of taking our love and divine love. In one sense, theologians have done a really poor job of making the two analogous. They wanted to say God's love is entirely different. There's no relational aspect. It's all giving and no receiving, all kinds of things like that.
Mhm.
But in another way, and this is the one I want to emphasize, I think there's been an implicit bias of thinking of human love and then not thinking God can be like this, or I'm sorry, and thinking that God's love is exactly like this. And that is this. Ryan earlier talked about how you and I make choices about whether to love. And I happen to think God's nature is love, and so God must love, and the choices God makes are only in the how and the why and the forms of love. But I think some theologians have intuitively thought, well, look, we choose to love. We could choose not to love. God must do the same. God must choose to love or not to love. And if it's something God chooses, it must not be essential to who God is. And since we're going to start with God's essential nature and attributes as telling us who God really is, then love gets put down the chain of attributes as not natural, as not magnificent as God's moral things, and God gets to choose God's moral, all that sort of stuff. And I think fundamentally it's a projection upon God of our own free choices of whether to love, rather than starting with God's nature as love and saying that is one way in which God transcends creatures. That was a nerdy answer, sorry.
All right, good deal. Let's move on to a question directed to Dr. Mullins. He says, you mentioned intrinsic value in these different worlds. Is there a most valuable world? If there is, does God have to create it? Or is there a world that's just good enough?
I don't think there's a most valuable world. There's several reasons for this. Typically, they have to do with how you try to do the evaluation of which one's the best, because there's several axioms along which they're the best. It's the best in terms of all the stuff that's in it. It's the best in terms of the way they're ordered, the best in terms of like the series of events. And I'm like, okay, so consider two different worlds. They're all exactly the same except for one difference. The one difference is I wear a blue shirt instead of a black shirt. That's it. How is that a better world? Like that, I don't care what anyone says. I'm like, that's just not a better world. So I don't think there's a best possible world. Even if you, here's the deeper problem though. I think that one of the things to evaluate a world along is how well does it satisfy God's goal? And I don't know what a best goal would be. Because if God wants to create a universe just to watch electrons spin in the void, like that's a perfectly fine goal to have. So okay, so God does that, and He destroys that universe. He's like, okay, next universe, let's do something else now. That's like a universe with just electrons that satisfies that goal really well. But is that the best goal to have? I don't think so. I don't know. I don't know what a best goal for a universe is. Now, when it comes to does God have to create it? I don't think so, because say there is a best possible universe that satisfies like whatever you could come up with a best possible goal that God would have. Is that goal like the most rationally compelling thing that God has to do? I don't know. I need to see an argument for that. So I don't know. I just don't understand the idea of the best possible world. I don't think it makes a lot of sense.
Dr. Oord, any follow-up on that?
That question usually assumes God starts with nothing and then can pick and choose amongst possibilities. And since I don't have a God who starts with nothing, it's not really a view. And since I also don't have a God who's omnipotent in the sense of being able to control and get whatever God wants, it's not a question that kind of registers in my framework.
Yeah, I do want to point out that you guys had a conversation a couple of years ago on omnipotence versus omnipotence over on Idol Killer. So that was a really good conversation that I checked out before having you guys on. So want to direct people to that as well. Let's bring on a question from Shane directed to Dr. Oord. Does an eternally creating status for God bring problems for His aseity?
All depends on what you mean by aseity.
Yeah.
If aseity means God necessarily exists, then nope, no problem whatsoever. If aseity means simplicity in the sense of God having experienced no time, moments of time, or having no particular attributes or all that sort of stuff, well, I reject that view of aseity. So I'm not bothered by eternally creating, bringing problems to that view. And Brian's also not a fan of that view of aseity. So it all depends. I think aseity's been hijacked by folks who have a classic view of simplicity that just makes no sense intellectually to me, makes no sense biblically, doesn't make sense in terms of analogies and ethics. It's just, I think, a super bad view. But I do think God is one, doesn't have particular divine parts, and is necessarily exists. In fact, I think necessarily creates. So there's aspects of that that I'm going to affirm.
Okay. Let's bring in a biblical question because our viewers are going to insist on, the views in question being, from Christian guests that we are consistent with the biblical data. So Mylan says the NRSV UE translates Genesis 1 as when God began to create, the earth was complete chaos. And I did have a question lined up in case we didn't have any viewer questions about the biblical data. So Dr. Oord, one of the key passages you note in your book on creation is Hebrews 11:13, which you interpret as saying that God created out of unseen things. So the negation there is put on the word seen. So unseen meaning that there are things that are unseen that God used to create. But most translations, other than the NRSV, have the negation on, put on a different word. It says what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. So it's a small difference there, but one that seems pretty significant to the discussion, right? Because if you're saying that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible, that's still consistent with creation ex nihilo. So I guess the question is, why should someone prefer the interpretation that you give for that particular passage rather than the one that most of the other translations give?
Well, isn't in both translations we have things that are being made and the things that is that you can't see what is being made from? Isn't it? Both of them have something to do with that.
So, like in the ESV and the NIV and the CSB, they all translate it as what is seen was not made out of things that are visible.
Yeah. So I could
So it's not
easily
that
just
they're
say,
unseen. Yeah.
yeah, I could easily just say, okay, so the things that, in my view, were present at the creation of the universe were not available to the naked eye. I mean, that wouldn't be so weird. I mean, especially if we think that, what is it, 85% of the universe is dark matter and nobody sees it, it wouldn't be a big stretch. So I can see the distinction between the translations. I don't think it ultimately supports creation out of nothing, and I can incorporate it into my view. Um, Usually, when someone brings up that passage, I like to bring up the Peter passage that explicitly says God makes the world out of water.
Hmm.
And then I say, okay, maybe at the end of the day, you think Hebrews has supports creation out of nothing because it says they weren't visible. Whatever God created out of wasn't visible, whether it was nothingness or invisible things, like I want to say. But you got other passages that seem to explicitly say God created out of something, in that case, water. Or I'll bring up other passages. So my strategies are A, to say the Hebrew passage doesn't require creation out of nothing, even if we take a non-NRSVU translation. And then two, say there's variation within the biblical text. You got to deal with that.
Okay. All right. Let's take one last question here. Let's go with this one. So from Mylan, One question I have for Dr. Mullins: without simultaneous cause and effect, does that pose a problem of procession or begetting of the Son and the Spirit?
Um, well, I think it's a problem even if you do have simultaneous cause and effect. So, say you allow for a cause and effect to be simultaneous, you'd still have the Son and Spirit being caused to exist. And if they're caused to exist, I don't see how they're going to have aseity, which is not having a cause for your existence. I think aseity is an essential divine attribute. So if the Son and Spirit don't have aseity, I don't think we have a Trinity. And I kind of want a Trinity. I'd like to have a Trinity. So I think just get rid of this cause and effect stuff between the Father and Son and Spirit on this point.
Okay. Any follow-up on that, Dr. Oord?
When it comes to the Trinity, I mean, there's just so many options on the table, and a lot of them don't make sense to me. So, yeah, I don't have much to say about. Well, I do have something to say. I think we should avoid appealing to the Trinity to solve metaphysical problems. How's that? I'll just stop there.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. We've been absolutely treated to a stellar discussion today between Dr. Thomas J. Oord and Dr. Ryan Mullins. If you want to learn more about them, I've included links to their websites in the description below. Again, we have several more discussions lined up for the rest of this year. Some really great guests going to be coming on. So please continue to follow us, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you guys next time. Gentlemen, thank you guys so much for joining us today. It was great. Yeah, go ahead.
Quick, I'm sure Ryan joins me in wanting to thank you, Tyson. Thanks so much for putting this together. This has been a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Yeah. I look forward to doing it again when your systematic comes out.
Great.
All right. Thank you guys. Take care.